Okay, welcome everybody. I'm just going to give it another few seconds for everybody to arrive. Just thrilled to welcome all of you to the Unfinished Business of the New Deal, a virtual roundtable discussion sponsored by the Living New Deal's New York City chapter. I'm Peggy Crane, the director of the chapter, which operates under the aegis of the Living New Deal, the California nonprofit that has been mapping New Deal sites around the country, 17,500 and counting, and bringing public attention to what the New Deal accomplished during an extraordinary decade in our country's history. Usually, in the events we've organized, we discuss those considerable accomplishments. But tonight, a stellar panel of economists and historians will explore what the New Deal left undone or partially done. From healthcare to housing, and from retirement with dignity to social, economic, and racial equity and equality, the New Deal's unfinished business stands as a many-pronged challenge to activists and policymakers today. It's as if the New Dealers were counting on us to take their achievements to the next level. But I don't want to be a spoiler, so let me leave it at that and introduce this evening's moderator, Kevin Baker, a scholar, a gentleman, a Renaissance man, and, as it happens, my neighbor on Manhattan's West Side.
There we go.
Kevin is an award-winning novelist, journalist, and historian. He recently completed a book on the history of New York City baseball and is currently completing a cultural and political history of the United States between the wars, for which he received a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2017. He also wrote the story for Ken Burns' new documentary series on PBS, The US and the Holocaust. So see you all at the conclusion of the discussion, just a little before 9:30. To you, Kevin.
Thanks very much for that lovely introduction, Peggy. She has to say that because we're neighbors and might run into each other on the street here. But thanks for that. And thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. I'm hoping we can do this sort of thing in person before too long, though I won't make any predictions about that, having just had my fifth COVID shot. So we have an all-star panel with us today. As a labor economist, Teresa Ghilarducci has spent her career working to ensure retirement security for all American workers. She joined the New School for Social Research as a professor of economics in 2008 after teaching at Notre Dame for 25 years. At the New School, she also directs the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis, which focuses on economic policy research and outreach. Welcome, Professor. Toure F. Reed is a professor of 20th century US and African American history and co-director of the African American Studies program at Illinois State University. Reed's research focuses on the impact of race and class ideologies on African American civil rights politics and on US public policy from the progressive era through the presidency of Barack Obama. He is the author of Not Alms, but Opportunity, The Urban League and the Politics of Racial Uplift, 1910 to 1950, and Toward Freedom, The Case Against Race Reductionism. Darrick Hamilton is the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy and the founding director of the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy at the New School. Considered one of the nation's foremost scholars, economists, and public intellectuals, Hamilton has been involved in crafting policy proposals such as baby bonds and a federal job guarantee, that have inspired legislative proposals at the federal, state, and local levels. Philip Harvey is a professor of law and economics at Rutgers Law School and counsel to the board of the National Jobs for All Network. He is an internationally recognized expert on the right to work, the original right to work, that is, before the right wing stole the term, that was promoted by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and later recognized as a fundamental human right in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, authored in part by Eleanor Roosevelt. He is the author of Securing the Right to Employment, along with several dozen scholarly articles on the subject, and was the principal architect and drafter of right to work legislation introduced in Congress by Representative John Conyers and Representative Frederica Wilson. So welcome to all. Thanks so much for being here with us tonight. The way this is going to work is we thought we'd start off with each panelist basically having 10 minutes or so of questions. And then each successive panelist can respond to earlier questions if they like, and they can jump in when they feel the spirit upon them. After that, we will go to a fully interactive discussion with our panelists for another 20 minutes, and then open up things for about 15 minutes of questions and answers from everyone. I have been ordered to be absolutely ruthless. So if I cut anyone off rather abruptly, please do not feel insulted. It is just that we are afraid you are being so brilliant that the rest of us will feel inadequate to joining in. So, Professor Ghilarducci, key elements in the New Deal, narrowing the disparity in wealth in this country and increasing its overall wealth, were Social Security and the recognition of labor's right to organize into unions. But in so building up these twin pillars of middle-class life in America, did something fall between the cracks, namely universal health care. Originally, President Roosevelt and his administration wanted to add what was then called health security to the 1935 Social Security bill. They tried that and tried again in 1939 and again in 1943. What stopped that from happening at the time? Was it the opposition of the doctors, the AMA? Was it in part that the union succeeded only too well in wresting healthcare from major corporations? And later, of course, we got Medicare and Medicaid to partly ameliorate the healthcare burden amongst the aged and the poor. But what was it that stopped us from getting the complete package of this in the first place?
Right. So I'm going to talk about the history of universal health care in this country.
Please, yeah.
It's rocky history, but I'm going to circle back to actually what the New Deal tried to do and was undone, which is to give workers the right to form unions, because that is actually the answer. The answer about why we didn't have universal health care sooner or better than we have now is because we have a weak labor movement. But let's talk about what happened with healthcare, because there's actually a little known aspect in the American system, and had to do with our role in World War II, that people don't appreciate as much, because the politics mattered later. But during World War II, we implemented a excess profits tax. Imagine that. The idea was that corporations especially in America, because we were arming the rest of the allies, that Congress anticipated that there were corporations that were going to make a lot of money just because of the excess demand or the unusual demand from the government. So they capped the profits on employers. And there was also a concern about inflation, about whether or not the excess demand for workers, their wages would actually start inflation. So there was also a provision that wages should not go up, but employers were having a hard time finding workers. So with the excess profits tax and excess profits and the limitation on wage growth, the only place the money could be put away for workers were in pension plans and in health plans. So the IRS regulations allowed companies to set up pension plans and health plans. Mainly they did it for their supervisors and white collar workers, but when there were unions, they brought it down to the blue collar workers. And so there was this unique position that the United States was in during World War II. Like we were getting rich off of it. Many men lost their lives and women, but we were in better economic straits because of the war, whereas the rest of Europe was being devastated. That had this peculiar history. So we come out of World War II with really strong healthcare system and a bureaucracy, and a human resource bureaucracy and a whole system set up for private insurance. And it took us quite a while, to get an extension of universal health care to people over 65. We had a near miss in 1965 when Medicare was established for everybody over 65. That's why it's confusing.
Yeah.
65 to 65-year-olds, that there was a provision to provide it universal health insurance for everybody under 14 as well. But there was unfinished business of the New Deal, but we are creeping towards universal coverage. Half of the healthcare expenses in this country is paid for by the government. Much of it, because many people are turning 65, is price regulated from CMS. But I just can take a few more minutes to talk about this checkered history of universal health care, and us having to spend so much political power to get it was because of the devastation of the labor movement right after the war, with the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act in 47, and then the subsequent act in 59, that just assailed whatever incipient union strength there was. The president of the United States during the New Deal said, "We want you to organize if you need to." And there was this sense that the social partners, business, labor, and government could put forth a new industrial state. And we had John Kenneth Galbraith saying that this is the right order of things. You need to have countervailing monopolies if we're going to have these American companies really dominate, capitalism, for Western Europe and even Japan. Then there has to be some countervailing monopoly against these monopolies, and that was supposed to be organized unions. And the Republican Congress and the Southern Democrats were not going to have that class unity. And so we are today, and I'll just close there, Kevin, we are today fighting for the PRO Act, which would give the 60 million workers who say they would join a union if they could in the United States. That's out of 135 million. 60 million workers, that's almost half of the labor force, say they would join a union today if they could. And there's just a lot of layers of labor law that doesn't allow them to do that.
That's encouraging to hear. And remind everybody again, if you would, just what the Taft-Hartley Act did.
It undid a lot of the New Deal. So as you said in your question, Kevin, two markers of the New Deal were the Social Security Act, which was wildly successful, only expanded, only gotten stronger, since 1935, and the National Labor Relations Act, that allowed workers to organize into unions and to obligate employers to bargain with them. And that's only gotten weaker. And that it got much weaker with Senator Taft and Representative Hartley, with a lot of support from Southern Democrats, overturned much of the National Labor Relations Act of 1935.
And they made it harder to use certain tactics, right? And also to organize at unions and such, right? And Truman vetoed it, but they overrode his veto.
They overrode it. I mean, the House and the Senate overrode it. And today we have a legacy of the Taft-Hartley Act that I think most people know about. And it's the so-called right to work, not Phil Harvey's right to work, but it's Taft-Hartley 14B. And it allows states to outlaw companies and workers to agree to have what's called a union security clause. So in some states don't outlaw that. So Ford Motor Company and the United Auto Workers come together and say, okay, every worker that's under this agreement has to pay some union service dues. It's the only way a union can really become a legitimate partner if they have some flow of revenue. But states, mostly in the South and Indiana and a couple of other ones, have passed laws, because it's allowed in the Taft-Hartley Act, not to allow companies and unions to agree to that, even if the company wants to.
That's amazing to me. And just in general, I mean, apart from unions, it's always amazed me how little support corporations have given to universal health care, because they end up picking up part of the burden themselves. And that was originally the case, right? Where wasn't Walter Reuther trying to get GM to go along and back national health care? And they said, no, we'll take care of it. And then that ended up almost bringing the whole company down, right?
Let's go back to the healthcare. We thought we had it in 1979, 1980. We had all these numbers to say, look, in Canada, a car is a lot cheaper than it is in the United States, maybe $1,000, because you don't have to pay for healthcare. But in-depth economic studies showed that the unions were able to pass those costs, the companies pass those costs on to the worker. And so the United Auto Worker has paid for every cent of his or her health care in the form of lower wages than they otherwise would have gotten. And so the companies knew, okay, they could pay a little bit, but pass most of the cost on to workers, or they would have to face this kind of unknown corporate tax. And corporate America went against saving money, because they really wouldn't save money. The workers already paid for it.
Amazing. And we're also seeing the erosion somewhat of Social Security with the higher ages you now have to retire on to get full Social Security, which seems horrendous. I mean, it's not like the added years of the good ones,
No, and the United States workers, American workers, work longer per day, per week, per year, and per lifetime than any of our counterparts in wealthy nations. And part of it is that you have to really work until 67 to get full benefits. You really have to work until 70 to get your full benefits, to get your maximum benefits. And we are just an outlier. And anybody else, who talks about raising the retirement age because we're all living longer, is ignoring the fact that we already work longer than anybody else, and that not everybody is living longer. Longevity has only gone to really the top half of the income distribution.
And this is now too, like we're now, I think Bismarck had like the first sort of national healthcare system in the 1880s in Germany. So we're now talking 140 years behind that.
Behind Germany, but most other countries did do their universal health care right after the war. That you'll see Spain and Italy and England, Canada, all came after World War II.
Not us. Professor Reed, talking about unfinished business, I think it is undeniable that race is business that was left unfinished from the New Deal. But is race ever finished in America? Or as a great writer once put it, the past is never dead. It is not even past. I think maybe the racial issue from this time that Americans know the most about is redlining. And undoubtedly it has much to do with the great gap in racial wealth in America today. Was putting anything better in place possible in the 1930s, considering the opposition there was, by the banks and by Southerners who had such outsized influence in the Democratic Party and in the Congress, or simply considering the general racism in America at the time? Would it have been possible to get around that at all at the time?
Oh, well, thanks for the question. Before I get into it, I do want to say something, that the current interest in redlining, which I think we all know denied nearly all African Americans access to federally backed mortgages until the Civil Rights Movement, basically, it's pretty interesting insofar as the now common sense understanding of redlining is informed by some fairly recent popular works by public intellectuals like Ta-Nehisi Coates or Richard Rothstein, both of whom have done a lot to bring attention to this important issue, which is good. But I think they also do a couple of counterproductive things. First, I think that there's a kind of false impression that scholars have long ignored or worse yet, downplayed, because ignored is worse, the history of the federal government's complicity in housing discrimination. And that's not true. But second, these and other popular accounts, I don't know, not only oversimplify the issues contributing to redlining, but they end up at fairly conservative conclusions that sometimes ironically downplay the long-term consequences of redlining. So I want to here I want to stress something, that earlier generations of scholars didn't just emphasize redlining's impact on Black wealth accumulation, which is what the discussion today, I think, tends to center on. Earlier generations of scholars pointed out that in the post-war period, when cities began to deindustrialize, aided by the Housing Act of 1949 and the Highway Act, redlining put well-paying unionized jobs out of the reach of many Blacks. And those jobs were every bit as important to homeownership as the FHA mortgage subsidies were. So that said, I just need to say that the New Deal did not invent housing discrimination. It did turn best business practices into policy. And that's a real problem. But the problem of redlining is owed largely to the fact that because the New Deal's goals were to establish a sustainable model or more democratic model, both of capitalism, homeowner policy was drafted by the real estate industry, basically, right? And that's a major part of the story that I think does not get enough attention. And in fact, it's worth stressing that this is precisely why something like 85 to 90% of the individuals impacted by redlining were white. Making loans to poor people, whatever their race, is always a risky proposition, right? Because you want the money back. And while Blacks across class lines were denied FHA mortgages, this was illustrative of the New Dealers' deference to capital rather than the inherent limitations of government, which I think is where we tended to coalesce. That said, a better approach to housing, which is the real question, at least in a long-term sense, would have been to pursue the kind of modern public housing that reformers like Catherine Bauer had advocated, in my view. And this overlaps, I think, with Teresa's point about healthcare, right? Because public housing on the European model, let's say, rather than the post-war model in the United States, would ultimately lower costs for working people, right? Understandably, public housing conjures the image of overcrowded, poorly constructed high-rises intended to warehouse poor Black people. And in the era of urban renewal, that's definitely what public housing became. But in a New Deal, Public Works Administration, public housing units like Carl Mackley houses in Philadelphia, Harlem River houses in New York City, Lakeview Terrace houses in Cleveland, were models for attractive, well-built, affordable, nonprofit public housing. And unfortunately, that model of public housing was foreclosed by a few things. President Roosevelt's concerns about budget deficits are part of the mix and can't be overlooked. The real estate industry successfully lobbied against massive expenditures in affordable, attractive public housing because those projects necessarily and explicitly would undercut the private housing market, which would deter people from buying homes. By 1937, the Wagner-Steagall Housing Act bound public housing construction to slum clearance, which is going to foreshadow what's going to come in the post-war era, and limit the capacity to build public housing. And some other issues, which I can come back to, but one that's worth stressing, again, that I think complements some of Teresa's excellent points, is that capitalists by the post-war period understood homeownership as a vehicle for demobilizing a militant working class, right? Encouraging them to identify a couple of or a few rungs above them on the class ladder. So this is part of the reason anyway, that whites get suburbs and Black people, poor Black and brown people get warehoused disproportionately in public housing. So the bottom line, last thing I'll say, is that that though this was not the inherent inability, this is not illustrative of the inherent inability of government to deliver for Black people. So the problem of redlining is, again, not illustrative of the inherent inability of government to deliver for Black people. The failure of housing policy, homeowner policy, reflected the undemocratic racial sensibilities of the day, but also the New Deal's commitment to creating a sustainable model of capitalism.
Yeah, Yeah. And would that have been, do you think anything would have been possible, any strategy would have been possible to force the banks, force the financial interests into actually going in and investing in these other neighborhoods? Or was that just, is that too heavy a lift? Was that something they were just not going to do?
I don't think that without a strong labor movement, so this gets us back to Teresa's point, basically, that this would have been politically feasible.
Yeah, very interesting. And that's the, and yet you see at the same point, with all the, the various deficits in extending all the New Deal benefits to African Americans, nonetheless, it's popular enough that this is the period when really African American allegiance in the major parties swings to the Democrats, particularly in the 1936 election. Do you think that reflected a enthusiasm for it, or at least this is sort of the best we can get at this point?
I think there's no greater evidence of enthusiasm for the New Deal among Blacks than the 180 degree flip between 32 and 36. And I mean, that's basically owed to the fact that to acknowledge and make plain, as scholars have long known, that the New Deal's rewards were unevenly spread, that there was discrimination, racial discrimination, to be clear, and New Deal programs is not to or should not lead people to overlook the fact that Blacks actually benefited pretty substantially from New Deal policies, right? I mean, Blacks are 10% of the total US population, in the time period that encompasses the New Deal in World War II. And were overrepresented among relief recipients in the aggregate in many instances. I think overall for welfare, overall is about 20% of recipients. Blacks were upwards of 15% of WPA recipients. At the start of the Civilian Conservation Corps, Blacks were clearly underrepresented, accounting for, I think, about 3% of participants, but by 38, they were 11% of participants. Harold Ickey's Public Works Administration construction quotas that ensured that Black workers would receive employment in PWA construction projects resulted in something like 20% of the semi-skilled workers in PWA sites being Black, and I think something like 60% of unskilled workers, right? So the fact of the matter is that the discrimination within the New Deal was real, but Blacks were, of course, these are policies that benefited working class people. Blacks were overrepresented among the working class and in the North, as contrasted with the South, and that's an important distinction.
Right.
That Blacks, of course, benefited from these policies, never to the degree of their need, right? Because Black unemployment was substantially higher than white unemployment. But the fact of the matter is, I think that we tend to view the racial disparities in the New Deal relief from the vantage point of 2022, when to make sense of the New Deal's implications for African Americans, it's really more appropriate to view the New Deal through the lens of what life would have looked like for Black people in 1922. And if you do that, then it's very clear that the progress that Black people made during the New Deal is transparent, right? And that it helps to explain the flip between 32 and 36.
Again, of course, the Depression had fallen disproportionately hard on African Americans, but nonetheless, at least that was somewhat acknowledged then. Great. Well, thank you, Professor. Professor Hamilton, kind of moving to the same subject there and a different aspect in terms of urban infrastructure. You have this really, as mentioned, the first real public housing going on, at least on the scale and with the care with which it was done. And some of that remains, as Professor Reed was saying, much sought after housing to this day, particularly in New York. It's difficult to think of what is not much sought after housing in New York today, but nonetheless, it's considered pretty first class. Eleanor Roosevelt spoke openly of how she expected public housing to be a continuing asset in American life for years to come, kind of anticipating the government would keep putting that out there. How come it has, is it all the years of neglect that has led to it having such a lower reputation politically? Even as we still need housing more than ever. What went wrong with that scenario that she saw?
So let me begin with gratitude. Gratitude for inviting me. Gratitude for assembling this great
coming.
panel.
Thanks for coming. Yeah.
And then also acknowledgement of Helen Ginsburg, who passed away a few years ago, and I know has been actively involved in both the Living New Deal as well as the National Jobs for All Coalition. She was a New School graduate, so I want to give that shout out. And just honor and recognize her and all the work that she contributed. And then, I also frame my remarks in terms of a reality that I don't think we all realize, which is that economics, politics, and identity group stratification, in the case of the US, that's often grounded in race, are never separable. And it is no place more displayed than with the New Deal. I think in both good and bad. I think a lot of what was presented just now, a second ago, about the ways in which race and class might be tied in some of the policies that were enacted that disproportionately benefited Black people is well worth shouting out. But also the politics of some of the compromises made to get the legislation passed, whose interests got compromised. I think often it was Black people. Teresa cited the Wagner Act, or the originally as providing some blueprint and grounding for workers. And it is probably not unknown to this group that 90% of Black women employed were employed as a domestic or agricultural worker, and over half of Black men, and that those forms of occupations were excluded from the protections of the Wagner Act and still are today. Indeed, Social Security excluded those forms of employment as well. So this is not a new story, it's been told, but I dare say that wasn't coincidental. Right. And I think that's related to the answer to your question that was framed. I think it is a useful context, in my view, to understand that the ways in which the New Deal got legislated had to not overthrow a largely racial apartheid system, particularly in the Jim Crow context of America. So it had to be legislated in a way without complete overthrow of that system. Likewise, some of the destruction of the New Deal that was cited by Teresa as well is grounded in the weaponization of race, is grounded in the associations of government and labor as unfairly tilting the scale in favor of these undeserving others. So it's useful to understand how race is weaponized in a broad view to answer the question that you raised. So over time, what the conception of public housing as originally legislated is different than what it is today. In addition, the structures that came about from things like redlining, which is also associated with urban renewal, is related to the overall framework of how economics, politics, and identity group stratification is not separable. So what's useful from all this? In my view, a progressive movement that's aimed at trying to legislate something that will be able to stand the test of time and not be vulnerable to a revolution that destroyed a lot of the programs that came out of the New Deal, is one that considers race and doesn't compromise the interests of race at its grounding. And why? Because that legislation, if authentically inclusive of individuals, is less vulnerable for being able to pick off dominant political groups later on at another date by offering them relative status, by telling them however desperate your condition is, however your lot in life, at least you're not this other group. And that to me is the politics of our day.
Yeah, and the politics, it seems, every day, often, back and forth since the start of the Republic. In terms of the actual physical structures too, I mean, there was a lot of emphasis, or at least a lot of theory on the part of FDR and New Dealers on kind of thinning out the city, because you looked at these horribly overcrowded slums. We had we'll thin it out, we'll build more parks, we'll have some towers, but that'll be better. But now it's shifted much more back, right, to kind of maybe higher density, that in order to survive environmentally, but also to provide opportunities to minorities, to others, we really have to have, if anything, denser cities. So is that something that we should be looking at now, and how possible is that?
Yeah, and I might reframe it. I don't think the question is density or lack of density. I think it's green space, non-green space, or good public use space versus non-public use space, and concepts of gentrification, where certain population, not gentrification is not the right word, but certain types of segregation and concentrations of certain populations into undesirable spaces. I guess gentrification is the right language, especially if we think about climate in this current current genre. Who has access to low-lying areas? Who has access to flood vulnerable areas? It would be naive to not think that that's not racially related, both in terms of contemporary policy as well as legacies from previous policies. I know the green community is talking about links to being concentrated in urban areas without trees, and what it does to the cost of trying to cool off your home in the summertime, and even literally survive and not die as a result of heat strokes of other climate related fatalities. One
thing that's maybe a little bit beyond the New Deal, strictly speaking, but in terms of is this a great example kind of Frederick Douglass's famous saying that power yields nothing without a demand? The fact being that A. Philip Randolph, with his Pullman union, which also includes, a lot of people forget this, but includes not only Pullman porters, not only these male employees, but also these female employees who were maids working on the Pullman cars on this huge rail network. Is that a good example? I mean, that comes a little bit with the war and all, and the demand that the munitions industries, the war industries, be integrated. And he threatens a march on Washington to force that. Is that a great example? We always think of, I think we too often think of, when we think of the New Deal, government and policy, but it was also all these grassroots movements, these unions, as Teresa was saying, that forced this stuff. Is that maybe one of the premier examples of that from the time? And a weapon that could also be, when the demand was met, put back in and used 20 years later,
Yeah, and broadly speaking, we use words like union, and I'm not anti-union, I'm supportive of unions, and I think the right to organize, but a broader frame is the ability to collectively bargain, and also collective efficacy, whether it's tied to your work or not, is a useful framing. But thinking about the example you cited, I would say that most people think of that as civil rights, as a notion of civil protest in order to gain rights for a racially stigmatized group. But equally important in that march was economic rights, a right to work, a right to a job. So a rights concept devoid of the economic right aspect is problematic. And we see that manifest in that great March on Washington, for which a lot of people beyond Dr. King certainly deserves a lot of credit, but I'm glad you cited Randolph, and we should cite Bayard Rustin as well, and his great work in this effort, as well as many women that were involved. But the reality, and I think the key takeaway is, one, in thinking about a broader frame of economic justice, one cannot think only in terms of civil rights or even political rights. Economic rights, literally the right to work, which Phil Harvey, who I know is next, has done a great deal of putting on our forefront. That's critical. That freedom can't be isolated in voting and right to assembly, but literally having a job is a critical element of freedom.
Thank you, Professor. And yeah, I should make clear when I introduce this that what Randolph was threatening was a march on Washington, unless that integration happened in the defense industries, and which was met with terrible violence in a lot of places by whites in the industry, but got done. Professor Harvey, and the cleanup spot here. We were talking before about how President Roosevelt all but bookends World War II with how he hopes to complete the New Deal, both globally and nationally. First, there's his Four Freedoms State of the Union address in January of 1941. In fact, on January 6, 1941, exactly 80 years before the insurrection, which is a kind of sad marker of where we've gone. But then also in his second Bill of Rights, or Economic Bill of Rights, State of the Union address on January 11th, 1944, I think we tend to think of these speeches as maybe distantly aspirational today, akin to, say, President Biden's repeated dream of reducing cancer to, a very admirable dream of just a chronic condition, something that's sincere, that's admirable, but not really possible. But in the case of American democracy today, why do these goals still seem so distant? We something like the Four Freedoms, of course, which Roosevelt called for existing everywhere in the world, has to per se is somewhat aspirational. It depends somewhat on many other peoples and many other systems. But the Second Bill of Rights calls for every American to be guaranteed a good job, a decent family home, enough money for at least adequate food, clothing, and recreation, a decent living for farmers, universal health care. There's health care once again, what will become Social Security, Medicare, unemployment insurance, and disability, a good education, and for the small business owner, freedom from unfair competition from monopolies and cartels. That seems to me a program that a large majority in America would support today, at least in theory. So why don't we see it?
I'm glad you asked that question. And I'm going to begin by pointing out that Roosevelt's articulation of this set of goals, of this set of rights, not only bookended his public advocacy before and after World War II, but it in fact goes back to the beginning of the New Deal. He gave a well-publicized speech in his first campaign for president that was almost the first draft for the Economic Bill of Rights speech. And I'm just going to read a couple of passages from that to make that point. This is Roosevelt. And incidentally, he wrote in longhand this section of the speech. His speechwriters provided the bulk of the speech, but the night before, he added this. As I see it, the task of government and its relation to business, and the subject of the entire speech was the relationship of government to business, is to assist the development of an economic declaration of rights, an economic constitutional order. This is the common task of statesman and businessman. It is the minimum requirement of a more permanent, safe order of things. And then a little further on, I feel that we are coming to a view through the drift of our legislation and our public thinking in the past quarter century that private economic power is, to enlarge an old phrase, a public trust as well. I hold that the continued enjoyment of that power by any individual or group must depend upon the binding quality of this greater social contract. The terms of that social contract are as old as the Republic and as new as the new economic order. Every man has a right to life. he began his speech by evoking the Declaration of Independence, which he was much fonder of than he was of the Constitution. Every man has the right to life, and this means that he has also a right to make a comfortable living. He may decline to exercise that right, but it may not be denied him. Our government, formal and informal, political and economic, owes to everyone an avenue to possess himself of a portion of that plenty sufficient for his needs through his own work. And of course, there's gendered language there, but we'll just ignore that. This was the sum and substance of the reform agenda embodied in the New Deal. Roosevelt was a pragmatist and an incrementalist. He fell short, and his policies fell short in a number of areas, as has been pointed out, but they undoubtedly advanced aspects of this overall agenda to a greater extent than ever before or since has happened in the United States. And the first of the rights that he said were essential to build a social contract on was the right to work. And I thank Teresa for pointing out that prior to the 1950s, when employers opposed to unions appropriated the term consciously to deny its use by progressives, before then, the right to work meant the right to a decent job. It's the right that Roosevelt promoted. And to this day, the right to work means that every place else in the world except the United States. So yes, the right to work in the Rooseveltian sense was the foundation of it all. It was the first of the 8 rights included in his Economic Bill of Rights. And a perhaps more telling statement was one that he made in his last State of the Union message, a year after the State of the Union message in which he delivered, in which he proposed his Economic Bill of Rights. In 1945, in his State of Union message, he said that he reiterated his support for the implementation through legislation of the Economic Bill of Rights. And he pointed out that the most fundamental of those rights was the right to a decent job, because it was the one on which the achievement of all the others in large part depends. If you secure people's right to work at decent wages, then the incidence of poverty goes down. People can afford good housing. They can afford food for their family. They can afford access to better education. All of the other rights are easier to achieve. And if you don't secure the right to decent work, it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to secure those other rights. So it was appropriate that progressives responded to his Economic Bill of Rights speech, progressives in Congress, by drafting legislation that was intended to secure the right to work. And now we can sort of transition to answering your question. What happened to this progressive agenda after the war? Why did it stall? Well, it stalled because the first battle failed, and other battles that followed it were delayed for decades. That first battle was over this legislation that progressives in Congress drafted to secure the right to work. And it failed because the House is gerrymandered then, as it is now, worse than it is now. And the Senate, of course, is an undemocratic body because of the 2 senators for every state. And so despite the support of the American people, which I think was clearly majority support at the time, the legislation to put in place the foundation of the rest of the rights that Roosevelt proclaimed was simply not achieved. And in that, just one more point about the support of the people. One of the phrases in his Economic Bill of Rights speech that always puzzles people is one where just before he lists the right, he says, this is quote, "We have accepted, so to speak, a second Bill of Rights under which a new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all, regardless of station, race, or creed. We have accepted it." What's he saying? Isn't he proposing something new? Well, no. he is saying that the Economic Bill of Rights has been what you have voted for since 1932 when you elected me president.
Right.
I've been elected 3 times. I'm running for my 4th term. I think that demonstrates popular support for this second Bill of Rights. We have accepted it. We just need to put it into effect. Now, why not? Well, I'm going to make a distinction now that I think is difficult to understand and perhaps difficult to accept. Progressives coming out of the New Deal and out of World War II were exceptionally fortunate in having 2 strategies available to them for securing the right to work. The first of these strategies was the one developed by New Deal social welfare planners with Roosevelt's support to use direct government job creation to provide work for everyone who couldn't get it in the regular labor market.
Right.
The second strategy was the one proposed by John Maynard Keynes more than a year after the New Deal strategy was implemented with the WPA, and that was to use macroeconomic policy, fiscal stimulation to raise the level of aggregate demand to the point that full employment would be achieved. During World War II, the Keynesian strategy won the debate over what should happen after the war for very good reasons. It was politically easier. The New Deal strategy looked like socialism, government employment. It could co-opt business support because all it required was spending money, and that money could be spent and would be spent contracting with private businces to produce whatever they produced for a
you had to build all these weapons.
And
put all these guys in uniform.
More popular strategy. And after World War II, the strategy did seem to work for 3 decades. It was the period when, not as much in the United States as elsewhere, it was the period when Europe established its welfare states. It was the period when in the United States, we established our mini welfare state, adding disability insurance to Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid in the 1960s, a whole range of anti-poverty programs.
And it strikes me that it strikes me that too. That's part of the liberal idea, was the idea that these fights are never, as opposed to the communist or the fascist idea, you're not going to produce a new man. The idea is that these fights always have to be fought over and over again, which is sort of the burden of it, but also the advantage of democracy. And hearing what you say too about his initial words back in 32 strikes me once again how wrong his opponents had it when they called Roosevelt a traitor to his class. I don't think he thought of himself as belonging to a particular class. I think he thought of himself, I think he thought of himself as a hill god, some of the time, but I think he thought of himself basically as somebody who was kind of a patron looking over the whole society and trying to bring that together, talking about this contract that he felt existed, even before the Great Depression, even before the New Deal, and trying to get back to that, which I think is a wonderfully humanitarian, humane view there. But just since we're starting to run a little low on time here, let me ask you about the other part of all that, the 4 freedoms, which again, it's much more dependent. It's something the U.S. can propose, but not impose on the world. But a few years ago, there was a wonderful joint museum exhibit in New York at the New York Historical Society and at Roosevelt House, which is one of the great unsung, terrific small museums in the city, but showing the original corny Norman Rockwell illustrations, illustrating, the vision of what the 4 freedoms could bring, what the Economic Bill of Rights could bring. And also, then they also asked these contemporary artists to come up with their visions of the 4 freedoms. And all they were able to produce was really kind of depictions of the abuses of those freedoms today, or very cynical kind of takes on something. It was, a very ironic picture of the family at the Thanksgiving table. does this have to come more from the bottom up than it does? Is it we who have lost hope and lost the ability to have that greater vision that's holding us back from anything? Do we have to generate that?
Well, it's funny that over the past several decades, progressives have become much better critics of what is than they have been advocates of what could be.
Interesting.
And I think that Roosevelt provided a model for doing the latter, and not just a model that articulated goals, but that was dedicated to the development of policies that would incrementally achieve those goals. And I think that we have spent much too little time on that project, and in part, especially in the area of employment policy, because since the mid-1970s, when the Keynesian strategy failed because of what we now know as its association at the top of the business cycle with engendering inflation, progressives have not had a strategy on which they agree for securing the right to work, which is the foundation of all the rest. And rather than going back to the drawing boards, and you wouldn't actually have to do that because you could rediscover the New Deal strategy, which not because they knew it at the time or planned it, but fortuitously does not have that problem. You could continue the progress that did occur in the decades immediately following the Second World War. There's no reason why the welfare state had to stop growing in the mid-70s. It could have continued to grow, but it has to have at its foundation a reasonably successful strategy for achieving the right to work. Without that, the rest is not going to fall into place.
Yeah, it seems like it's all the more important today to have more of a welfare system.
Yeah.
Although it also strikes me now that we kind of have gone from having a citizen's idea of democracy to kind of a consumer's, where we just kind of want things presented to us that we can pick and choose from instead of founding things. So Peggy, how are we doing on time there?
I think we're out.
I think, well, in any case, happy to kind of continue this with anything you guys want to throw up there, anything you feel that we could use more light on, and to get any questions from anyone out there. So we'd love to hear from you guys, and anybody here. What have I missed? What have you wanted to get in general?
Yeah, we
Kevin.
could just, oh, sorry, Peggy.
Oh, just quickly, Kevin, I'm speaking out of the depths here.
Okay.
Check the chat. There are some interesting questions when we get to that. Okay.
Okay, great.
But please go back to what you were saying,
So
Teresa.
I'm sorry, Teresa.
No, that's okay. It actually refers to some things I see in the chat that people are really wanting to look forward, like from this history, what is possible, what is really important for maybe each of us have different views about if we could just pick one thing, what would be change. So since I brought that up, I don't want to start first. Could I impose upon my panelists and go maybe right to Phil? What's the one thing you would change that would move us forward? And I left that vague. What's forward?
Am I still unmuted?
Yeah, you're fine.
Yeah.
We can hear
Okay.
you.
That's an easy softball question for me. I think it's enacting legislation that would in fact secure the right to work. It would actually save taxpayers money, and it would make it possible not only to secure the right to decent jobs, but because of using the New Deal strategy for doing it, it would unleash a whole billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of new resources to address all the other unmet needs that we've discussed, such as housing. So I think Roosevelt was right. That's the foundational right on which the others can be built. So that's what I would propose.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I guess I'll jump in unless.
Yeah, please.
I think some lessons from the political framing is that the next iteration of legislation needs to be intentionally anti-racist and anti-sexist. It needs to be intentionally inclusive in its design, management, as well as implementation. Those are some clear lessons. I'd also say I don't think Keynesian failed. I mean, I definitely have a different take than Phil on Keynesian economics. You know, I associate it with industrial policy, and I also don't think it's distinct from an economic rights framework. Industrial policy, the strategic application of government resources and power and ways to promote the economy. You know, frankly, I think our most treasured resource is people. So I think an economic rights framework is consistent with industrial policy of investing in the dynamism of what people can do. So the question of looking forward, we have no idea what can be generated when people are well-resourced. And to me, that's a key point, something that can come out from the New Deal legislation, a New Deal legislation.
Well, and speaking of that, speaking of Keynesianism and inflationary aspects in the 70s and all, that was one question we had there, was somebody asking, we are told this stuff now that if we have, I remember during the Elizabeth Warren campaign, we were told that universal health care that she was proposing was basically unaffordable in the United States, which you would think would have led to the obvious question is, how is it affordable everywhere else in the world? But our media didn't get there. But that raises the question today, how is it that other countries are able to do this? Question from Michael Van Stein here. How is it the other countries are able to do this kind of full social welfare state and have a thriving middle class and lower poverty, and yet not have the enormous deficits that we tend to run? Is it purely military spending? Is it other things?
Well, I think our understanding of inflation ignored some of the geopolitical implications of the 1970s, the impositions by foreign states with regards to manipulation of oil prices. Yeah. I think that spending on productive attributes of our economy are not inflationary. And I don't think deficits in and of themselves are problematic. The problem with deficits is when it goes towards non-productive attributes of our society, and that becomes inflationary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, such as the military or other things.
In this economic rights frame, and I'll stop talking after I say this real quick, the economic rights frame that we're talking about has automatic stabilizing effects in them that are cyclical, that are counter-cyclical. Government spending goes up when there's an economic downturn and contracts when there's economic expansion because the rights are fulfilled by other mechanisms of the economy.
Dr. Reed, you were saying?
Well, I was going to say, and I've had a dicey internet connection. You ripped me off, Kevin. I didn't get to respond to Teresa's question.
Okay, please
left
do.
One of the speakers out. Thank you very much.
Please do.
These things happen. These things happen.
Yeah.
But if I recall Teresa's question, it was something to the effect, it was the one thing that you do. Well, I would say this, and this connects the dots between, I think, everybody to one degree or another, that the civil rights movement did a lot, and it certainly helped people like Darrick and me make our way into the middle class, which is a good thing. But one of the reasons, a key reason that the civil rights movement failed to redress the material aims that A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin had advocated by way of the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which Darrick had mentioned earlier, and the Freedom Budget for All Americans, is that the signature pieces of legislation associated with the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 65, and of course the Civil Rights Act of 1968 and Fair Housing piece, Title 8, were passed about a decade or so into urban deindustrialization, and not long enough before stagflation, right? And these issues that Phil was talking about earlier that undercut progressive policies, but also undercut Blacks' upward mobility. So with that in mind, it strikes me that, and this gets us back to, again, points that Phil and Teresa made previously that overlap some points that Darrick made, that if there were one thing that we could do, it would be to establish, for all intent and purpose, a right to a job at a living wage for all Americans. As I'm going to reiterate that the organizers of the 1963 March on Washington insisted that while Averill of Randolph was clear that a Fair Employment Practices Act at the federal level was necessary, he was no less clear and correct that it would be by 1963 insufficient, right? Because profit-geared motivation was eliminating jobs from tens of millions of workers, irrespective of race. So the anti-discrimination piece, and that's the term I like. I like anti-discrimination a lot better than anti-racism, because to me, anti-racism feels somewhat atavistic. Before there was a New Deal, before there was a civil rights movement, you had something on the spectrum of anti-racism through the race relations model, which was anything but an effort to redress material inequalities, right? And anti-racism ends up being a bit too porous for me in what it can mean. Anti-discrimination, straightforward. Anti-discrimination policies, essential. And they are obviously in jeopardy. But what we haven't done in decades, really since the New Deal, was try to redress the structural economic sources of inequality. So a right to a job at a living wage for all Americans, if there's only one thing, then that's the one I would go with.
And Teresa, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely fascinating that we have, we've landed on jobs as a path of emancipation and equity. With the attendant, I'm looking at my friend and colleague Darrick, with intentionality to be inclusive and to overcome racism and xenophobia and patriarchy. I want to say, Ture, just to emphasize your point, anti-discrimination is a better word for civil rights, because I wouldn't have gone to college without civil rights. I was part of the Equal Opportunity Act because I grew up in a poor single mother headed household. So without the Civil Rights Act, there wouldn't have been that money to send me to college. Sex discrimination, putting in sex in the civil rights legislation was an afterthought, and it was meant to kill it. Oh, we're going to have rights for women. Well, we're going to end this whole, and that's the legislative history. We're going to end this whole idea of anti-discrimination. So I think it's just fascinating that we've looked to employment and good employment as the course. And therefore, my one thing is to make sure that workers can organize and collectively bargain, take collective action to make those jobs better.
I think that's.
And are there any progressive people, like anyone who identifies as a progressive, who thinks that anti-discrimination policies are passé? I mean, are there?
I hope not, because I think they're pretty vital. Let me throw out one other.
Transparently so, I would think.
Yeah, I would hope. And
I think Darrick had one coda.
Go ahead.
I mean, to me, anti-discrimination is not as broad and structural as anti-racist, anti-sexist, or intentionally inclusive. To me, anti-discrimination doesn't do enough to redress some of the distributions of resources that have come about from previous discrimination, as well as structures that are grounded in history, which is why I think we need to evolve beyond anti-discrimination. I think currently our notions of anti-discrimination even disproportionately put the onus on individuals as opposed to structures. Where right now the way we implement it is, if you're discriminated against, you're supposed to bring claim, and as a result of that claim, if there's an adjudication process and you're found that you're discriminated against, they're supposed to be redressed. The other language is more forward-looking and also shifting of responsibility. And then one other thing to push back on, I think a right to job is a necessary, but certainly not sufficient. And perhaps we all agree on that. But I think the other aspects of economic rights are not tied to jobs in a direct way and still necessary. In other words, one of the things that the New Deal also did was implement a right to capital to a dominant white group in ways that generated an asset-based middle class. And we know Ira Katz-Nelson talks about that, but a right to capital is as important to one's ability to be self-determining as a right to a job, I'd say. And both are useful, and we need to avoid the framework of scarcity, where we have to limit the amount to talk about one specific right when they all are necessary and reinforcing.
Well, I just want to say one thing. I mean that, well, maybe as a professor, one thing always means five, right? So I'll just concede that out the gate, that in one sense, you and I are not disagreeing, because we both insist that anti-discrimination policies by themselves are insufficient, right? But as I read anti-racism discourse, it's funny, I read it almost exactly the opposite way from you, which is that it lends itself quite readily to individualist solutions to what are fundamentally structural problems. It doesn't have to, right? And I think many people who insist on anti-discrimination policies alone, and I'm not one of them, likewise don't think that anti-discrimination policies have to lend themselves to individual solutions, but they often do. But precisely because anti-discrimination policies lend themselves potentially to quite narrow solutions that sidestep some of the structural sources of inequality, like, I don't know, low wages, let's say. And I'll tell you, look, I mean, I worked for what it's worth, and it's not much worth. It's not worth much, sorry. I worked the 1 year of my 20s that I wasn't in school. I worked as a permanent temporary employee in the city of New Orleans in 2 different jobs. Yeah. Talk about an oxymoronic title, right? That
yes, was very much.
Yeah. Most of my coworkers were Black. My manager was Black. Within certain anti-racist frameworks, the fact that I had a Black manager would necessarily mean that I had arrived. The fact that I had a Black site manager didn't do a damn thing to change the fact that we all got laid off right before Christmas. Yeah. And while I didn't mind, because I had other things to do, so it was fine with me. It was a horrific thing to watch. And I think one of the problems with the way that anti-racist discourse has played out over the years, and again, I'm not trying to be facetious or glib when I suggest that it feels very much like a return to the kind of race relations model that dominated in the years, Black politics in the years before the New Deal, is that representation matters only to an extent. As I said, having a Black site manager didn't do a damn thing to prevent my coworkers and me from being laid off. Yeah. And the last thing I'll say is, and I think there's a difference of politics, I just don't care about millionaires and billionaires. So the assets, I feel quite privileged as a Black middle class, upper middle class in origin man, middle-aged man. My father's an Ivy League professor. My mother's a corporate executive. So again, I came from a relatively privileged, I would say very privileged by Black American standards, background, as do many of the people in my bloodline. So there's I just don't care about millionaires.
If we can just get Phil in here, who has raised his hand.
Another term for what we're describing is substantively equal opportunity, equal life chances. Sure. Which I like because of the way in which it is described in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's not an equal right to compete for scarce good things like jobs. It's an equal right for everyone to have the full development of their personhood, a right that attaches to people who are not allowed to develop in that way for a lot of reasons: race, gender, disability, sexual orientation. The list could go on. Where you happen to be born in the world, who your parents are. There's a lot of sources of disadvantage. And if we're going to equalize the right to everyone's full development to whatever extent they are capable of and in the ways that they prefer, I think that's the best way to articulate the goal.
And Darrick, you had a
so equal opportunity is a political ruse. Matter of fact, when you call for an economic rights framework, that's not equal opportunity. You're guaranteeing a right to something. Right now, who's opposed to opportunity? That's a straw man. But in reality, we've used that as a mechanism.
That's not what he was saying.
You're not listening to what I
That's
said
not what he
after
said.
the first half sentence. It's the right to the full development of everyone's full personhood.
Right.
That is a
I
right.
heard what you said, but
That's
I'm
a right,
critiquing the use
not
of
an
the word.
opportunity to compete.
Well, let me shift. Let me shift back to another.
I'll get the thought out because I heard exactly what you said, but like I said, it's rhetoric, and what we're doing today, like the conversation has shifted to rhetoric. So a critique of an anti-racist frame obviously has a contemporary political framework that certain people are starting to use. So subtle in our critiques of words are critiques of political movements. So and one thing I'm saying with clarity, I hope, is that the use of that word opportunity has become weaponized in a way that's destructive. It has become weaponized in a ruthless way to put the onus of responsibility on.
Right.
I'll stop.
Okay,
there's no argument with that.
That's a great point.
Right.
And to get,
I mean, there's no argument at all with that point.
Well, we're having an argument.
No, we're having not an argument about the meaning of opportunity and how it's broadly used. You might be imagining we're having an argument because you're projecting on to fill in me arguments that neither of us, and I'll just speak for myself, that I have never made, ever. So you are having an argument with someone who's not in this room on the meaning of opportunity. And in terms of
using jargon that is representative of a discourse that I'm critiquing.
Well, I'm curious, how am I using jargon when I say I prefer anti-discrimination, because anti-racism has, some would say, been co-opted, some would say weaponized, right? Which is consistent with jargon. If I'm making the point, it's a fairly narrow point, that the reason that I prefer anti-discrimination is that it highlights what the actions are and offers some window onto what the fix is beyond, let's say, something like anti-racist training, as which anti-racism can lend itself to. And I didn't suggest that it only lends itself to that, but you could make the point that I'm suggesting that anti-racism has been weaponized, as people are apt to say, to ends that are run counter to a just society of the sort that I think you and I, for the most part, would embrace. And that's the point that I at least have the courtesy to not suggest that you are using jargon as you have done to me, because that's not what's happening here.
Well, all right. So perhaps we can move on. But I certainly didn't say anti-racist training in my discourse.
I didn't say that you did. My point was that
allow me to finish when I'm talking. No, that's disrespectful and rude.
What's even more disrespectful is putting a straw man on me.
I think let's
right. I mean, that's equally disrespectful.
I think I think let's I think we're
it's not funny.
Kind of talking around in different ways here. Let's move on to another,
for no good reason.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Let's move on to another piece of unfinished business, which relates to, again, to work and employment and all. We've talked about unions throughout this. I mean, the union movement got the work week down to about 40 hours from where it had been something like, 96 hours, 70 hours, whatever your employer wanted it to be. And it's been reduced to 40 hours, but that was 75 years ago, longer. Why are we not talking about more leisure time, about more time off for everyone? Why have we moved from working one really hard industrial job to working like, 3 really wearing jobs now? Why aren't we at home more? Why aren't we with the kids more? Phil, did you have a?
Yeah, putting on my lawyer's hat. I think that one of the things that American progressives don't adequately recognize is that there is not just one model of unionism. I discovered this when I decided to teach comparative labor law and realized that the structure and legal framework in which unions operate and are created differs. And the countries where unions prosper, like Germany, Sweden, France, South Africa are countries where the law supports it. And in the United States, the law has cabined the labor movement in a way that undermines its strength. It forces labor unions to organize on the basis of a single collective bargaining unit in one place, while the employers have established a global organizational structure. How can you hope to defeat a global economic structure with one that focuses on organizing in one place? And another characteristic of countries with successful union movements and successful welfare states is that they all have developed laws that promote bargaining at the macro level rather than simply at the local level, which doesn't mean there's no bargaining at the local level. There is, but there is bargaining at the macro level to establish a framework in which local bargaining can occur. And I really don't think that the union movement in the United States has any chance of resurrecting itself under the present structure. It just doesn't fit the economy.
Okay, interesting. So, yeah.
No, I don't agree. I think where you were going was I was agreeing with until that very end. It's really the laws, that actually prevent workers from unionizing. The unions, once organized, will set an industrial, bargaining strategy, organizing strategy, but with allowing Starbucks to pay non-unions stores who didn't vote for a union higher wages in direct violation of labor law, and let them do that without any fines or problems. And that's just multiplied many other times where employers can stop the legal rights of workers to organize and without any challenge. That is the first line, and how they organize after that is really not.
There's a conundrum, though. You can't change the law unless you organize, but you can't organize if the law won't let you.
Well, that is politics. I mean, Kevin, just to answer your question, economists have asked this question many, many times. Why is it in the United States we surpass the rest of our colleagues? I think it was Germany and then Japan in working hours. I mean, the Japanese and the Germans used to work more hours than us in the 1980s and 1990s, and now the American worker works more hours per year than even Japan. And why is that? And it really does go back to the lack of labor having a voice in politics and in laws, and at the workplace. It is just quite stunning, that Americans do work more hours per year and more years per lifetime, even with large numbers of people going to college. So it is rooted in our pension systems, which require people to work a lot longer, and just really the lack of any kind of family leave, and for all of us who worked on Saturday and Sunday, the lack of the weekend.
Yes, yeah, very much so. It's
because we had this event on Monday on top of all the other ones. And what are we doing? You think any German academic would be doing a webinar at 9:30? I don't think so.
Although I did once do a reading at a German university in the middle of the day, and I was astonished that anybody showed up.
Yeah, in the middle of the day.
So,
right? They did, right? Because they work in the day.
They have their own hours. Yeah.
When I was practicing law, we once represented a client in Dusseldorf, Germany, and I went there, and I was shocked when the lawyers went home at 5 o'clock. Okay, time to go.
Right.
Yes, you have a life. You're entitled to a life.
Or the French actually eat lunch. Right?
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Forever, but yeah. Well, this has been very interesting. Thank you so much, guys.
We've had some great comments in the chat. I just want a shout out to the audience.
Oh yeah, do you want to bring any of them up, Teresa? Or?
Yeah. Well, I hate to bring up the one that I responded to, but Michael did ask, what is possible in the United States? We have a president that is probably more progressive, closer to FDR than we've had since FDR. We do have a Senate that may stay Democratic. You know, we do have some hope in the House. What is possible in the United States? We have the infrastructure bill. I'd love to know from Darrick, from Phil, from Toure, whether or not that infrastructure bill has enough language about good jobs creation.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And it does seem, at the point you brought up too before about, you know, you just let these people in for one term, you know, one midterm election, and who knows what they'll do on the right wing. But yeah, is that, anybody want to speak to that about the infrastructure bill or about ways to do this? Or
the question of what is possible, I think there are lessons to gain from the New Deal, from A. Philip Randolph as well. In that, you know, I think the Roosevelt famous question, don't ask me to do something, make me do something. So what is possible is what we demand. What is possible is collective action and making them do it. I think, you know, we certainly have capacity. If the question is, do we have capacity to implement this vision of an economic bill of rights?
Absolutely.
We've demonstrated the ability to generate large sums of resources and direct them directly to people with relative ease. So I think the capacity question can be addressed. The question of will we is a political question. And I hope if I get one thing to come about from the lessons of the New Deal, and what I hope is garnered from this webinar, is that the divisions along race, along gender, and other identity groups can't get lost in that new vision, and that we have to be intentionally inclusive. And if we leave it to fate, it won't be.
Yeah. Professor Reed, would you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, and I think, again, that relates to points that Phil and Teresa had made previously. You have to use pressure tactics to extract policy, right? And Phil was talking about policy, and Teresa was talking about organized labor as a vehicle for pressuring policymakers to achieve those ends. And I think that's consistent, ultimately what Darrick was getting at. And of course, I mean, I think it's a foregone conclusion that those of us who are progressive, at least who identify as progressive, are invested in matters of racial inequality and sex inequality and various forms of so-called identity inequality, though we haven't been so good about advancing the cause of economic justice in my lifetime. And I'm a Gen Xer, so it's a long time at this point. And I wouldn't suggest for a moment we've been very successful on advancing the cause of racial sex inequality, or as successful as we could have been, I should say. But we haven't done class in a long time.
There's something strange about the era we are in, the neoliberal era. If you look back over American history, it's clear that the pendulum swings. There's the Gilded Age, followed by the Progressive era, followed by the Roaring 20s, followed by the New Deal, followed by the quiescent 50s, followed by the 60s and 70s, followed by this era. And this era has now lasted over 40 years, when those earlier shifts never took more than 20, 25 years. We've had opportunities when the political momentum seemed to be beginning. The most dramatic was when Obama was elected president. What I think that we have lacked is a strategy, a way of taking advantage of those periods when they arise. And certainly the virus was another such era where it did result in very, very dramatic action very quickly. But I don't think we do have an overall strategy of how to bring all of these segments of the political world, or at least enough of them together to have the kind of overwhelming majorities that are necessary for real change. We have been successful in some areas relative to others. The advancements in the area that we specialized in, identity politics, are tangible. But I think that as Toure said, they're not matched by developments in the economic justice area where we've been playing defense for 40 years without a strategy to win the game.
And it's impacted Black people disproportionately badly too, right? I mean, that failure to advance an agenda that would benefit working class Americans.
Right, which includes all those white workers who vote for Trump.
That's right.
Yeah, as the Depression did too. Yeah. Teresa?
Just to look forward. I wish we had an invigorated labor movement, and maybe it starts, little seeds that if we had one, I think we would have had enough strength to resist what the Federal Reserve is doing now. I mean, it is engineering a recession. It's using ancient and wrong ideas and an assessment of the situation from the 1970s. And if we had a labor movement that would resist what the Federal Reserve is doing now, to look at other tools they could use. And we know who's going to be unemployed first. It's going to be those who have tried hard, to keep their jobs. So it's not that we don't have job guarantees in our infrastructure. When we see, do public policy, but we have a public policy that makes jobs actually the blunt tool to solve problems that were caused by the war in Ukraine and supply chain problems due to the virus. So that's what we're missing. It's not something vague. It's actually at this moment, if we had a labor movement, we could fight the Federal Reserve's policies to engineer a recession.
I think that's a great point. And I think that was sort of the end of the old liberalism was Volcker comes in to Jimmy Carter, who says, how are you going to deal with inflation? And he says, I'm going to melt down the economy. And Jimmy Carter says, okay. And that's
and we're doing the same thing. Right.
He should have said, thank you very much. Leave that way, and I'll get somebody else in here who can do this. So, well, this has really been very invigorating. We've had a couple other comments with someone who thought we should mention the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which would be a great idea. And someone
actually,
else.
Let me say something very, very briefly about that. Someone asked, where do you get how do you, I think it was you, Kevin, how do you get the bankers to invest in housing?
Yeah.
You didn't have to in the New Deal. The Reconstruction Finance Company did it. And there actually is a bill in Congress right now that would reestablish a public bank that would be able to do the same. You wouldn't have to get the private banks to do it. You can get a public bank to do it.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting too, what we talk about. And we talk about, I don't know, sometimes it seems like we talk about everything in euphemisms. We talk about the density of cities. I've been living in the same street for over 40 years, and I've seen one high rise after another go up, and they're all luxury condos, and they're all driving every business in the area out of business. So, and then we had somebody also who wanted us to talk about hyper concentration in media, but I'm afraid Mr. Murdoch will have to wait until another day, or he could even die. That's possible. So Peggy, are we? I don't know what the deal with the devil is, but he could die at some point.
I just didn't have the heart to step in and be some stern school mistress and say, okay. No, it was really too worthwhile, and I just want to thank you so much. I wish that we could reconvene at some point and have like a part 2.
Yes, that would be great.
If that's possible, get in touch with me and I will organize it.
Okay.
It was just so great. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise with such generosity, and
thanks.
And thank you, Kevin, for keeping everything moving and knitting it all together.
Thank you, and thanks all of you, even for your passion too. I know it got kind of heated, but I think that's one indication that everyone here cares about what we're talking about.
Yeah, and you know what? We're all so out of the habit of getting into a juicy argument. What's so wrong with it? We can't always be nice little ladies and gentlemen and agree on everything.
Yeah.
So, but I think that that we agree on the basics. That's the thing.
Well, that's
So
And-
listen, thank you so much. Thank you to the audience. I wish that we could have gotten to your questions. I do plan to collect them and figure out a way to have a kind of follow-up, even just by MailChimp or by email
right.
or something. So
Good
much
night, everyone.
appreciation. Good night,
Good night.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
great
you.
meeting you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Peg, was there anything else you wanted to say about the Living New Deal? Or no,
Just
that's-
basically the Living New Deal. Please feel free to visit the website at livingnewdeal.org. Many of you already know about it, but it's just a phenomenal resource. And also, thank you for reminding me of that, Kevin. Please also consider making a little donation or even a bigger donation to the New York City chapter of the Living New Deal.
You have to
are-
pass the plate. Yep.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Thanks so much,
thank you
everyone.
very much again, and I hope to see you all soon.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
I went.
Bye-bye.